Welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. I'm Shane Morris. I'm here with John Stonestreet to answer your questions. These questions are based on Breakpoint commentaries and podcasts that we've aired recently, short courses that we've held, and articles and columns we've posted. And if you want to submit a question of your own, you can do that by emailing us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. John, this headline came from the Babylon Bee a while back. I forget when it was, maybe during the election, but but it's just so applicable to the attitude that many of us are so tempted to adopt that a new administration is coming in. It went like this: new Bible feature removes Romans 13 for when you don't like the president, and isn't that true? I mean, the punchline of it all, though, is that Paul wrote Romans 13 under a government that was pretty far cry from what we'd call the ideal of liberty and protecting individual rights and so forth. And yet it's still applied in some very significant way. And I guess our job as good readers of the Bible is to figure out exactly how that applies and where the lines are and stuff. But, obviously on the heels of what happened last Wednesday, we're getting a lot of questions from people who want to know how to approach this, not just from the standpoint of, how do I vote and how do I submit to the government, as Romans 13 says, but what should be my attitude in the midst of it? What kinds of policy should I be pushing for? Should I even have the idea of that this government is legitimate, that I should be, submitting? And when does constitutional order break down? There was one question in particular that we got here. And I think you had a thought here real quickly, John, before we jump into it.
Well, I just want people to understand. I understand the difficulty, right? Yeah. Because it's even different, I think, from the first readers of Paul's exhortation in Romans 13, because, at that point you're talking to a group of believers. Well, first of all, the church is pretty new at that point. But secondly, there had never been an experience or even a recent cultural memory of a government that offered things like religious freedom to this extent, or the other freedoms, that was trying to build itself around, at least to some degree, some pretty commonly held moral norms that are in line with, if not even based on, biblical teaching, right? So many people have talked about us being a post-Christian culture, and I think in many ways that's right. I mean, I'm not saying that we've ever kind of achieved Christian culture, but at the same time, you can see it from here, and it was a lot better than, dodging one crazy emperor to the next, to the next, to the next. But Romans 13 is still true, for all those people that mocked. A lot of people said, well, God put Trump in office, and people mock that. But that's what the Bible teaches. God did put Trump in office. And you know what else? That God actually put Biden in office. And that's going to be hard, right? I remember once getting forwarded an email from an academic dean at a little Christian school who's trying to help the teachers navigate kind of how to teach biblically, and he gave some really, I think, well-meaning but funny advice. One was like, if you're teaching history, teach about God's providence in the defeat of the Spanish Armada. That God was at work there. And you know what?
That's a pillar of Protestant historical teaching.
Oh,
right
it
there,
is,
John. You really have to believe that God was at work there in the sinking of the Spanish
I do.
Armada.
But the point is he was providential for both the British and the Spanish, right? I mean, in other words, it was providence for all of human history, and we've got to remember that heading in, and it's really hard. It doesn't mean we shirk our responsibility as citizens, shirk our responsibility to question things we think are misguided or controversial or problematic or whatever. But this question came up this weekend. I was speaking to one of our wonderful Colson Fellows affiliates groups down in Texas. And they were asking about, how do we respond to dystopian visions, because so many of them seem to be coming true, whether 1984 or Brave New World. I thought it was such a great question. How do Christians respond when things seem to be falling apart? The difference between George Orwell and Christianity is, to George Orwell, dystopia was the whole story. For Christians, dystopia is just chapter 2, you know, and that's a really important thing. Dystopia doesn't win the day, and we have got to ground our understanding of the chaos and the ultimate story of redemption while holding on to this vision of hope. Despair is a sin. Let's just keep quoting Chuck Colson. Despair is a sin, at any time in history.
Well, in this specific question that we're looking at here, John, that you brought up just before we got on to record this, was about the Constitution and whether it's still really functioning and how we can live as Christians in a time when, according to this questioner, the Constitution put into place to protect us is failing us. So let's talk about that and walk through it, because it's a question bound not just in Christianity and the New Testament's teaching on our role as citizens, but in a specific time and place, America in this year, 2021, and in light of all the events that have transpired in the last, I want to say 4 years, but really it's bigger than that.
Oh, I think it's absolutely bigger than that. Look, our Constitution is remarkable. Our founding documents are really they stand out in the history of founding documents, or in looking at the history of nations. They're remarkable in so many ways. They're not flawless. They are built, and in some places they're deeply flawed. In other places they reflect. In most places, however, they reflect, I think, a particular view of what it means to be human, who God has made us to be. And it's an acknowledgement that the state doesn't determine who we are. The state doesn't give freedoms. The state is to recognize God-given freedoms. That in and of itself is a remarkable innovation that led to all kinds of great things. So I always want to back up when someone says, and I've been asked this question a lot lately, I'm sure you have too, about the failure of the Constitution to handle us. And I think, look, one of the most consistent themes from our founding fathers is that our form of government requires a particular kind of person. Right. In other words, if the thing falls apart, it's not the failure of the system. It's not the failure of the government. It can be the failure of the government, but it's not the failure of the document. It's not the failure of the ideas.
Sure.
It's the failure of the citizen. And I don't think the Constitution is failing us, quote unquote. Yeah. In fact, one might look at it and say, think of everything that happened in 2020. Think of everything that happened just in the last 3 weeks, and how many nations around the world would be done, just from that, right? Just what happened. It would be a lot worse over here, a lot worse over there. We still have kind of ongoing challenges and so on. How many economies could handle this? How many, houses of government could handle this? And the answer is that most of them couldn't. So one could look and say, look, it might be just the system that's holding things together right now. But the founding fathers have always said that, this is a moral constitution for a moral sort of person. And I think one of the truisms of history is, if people can't govern themselves, they can't be governed. It doesn't matter, what else takes place. If we're the type of people that can't govern ourselves, there's not much of it. It's going to be a short-lived future, however you put it.
Well, and self-government is the idea behind the American experiment, right? That we are going to be a self-governing people. We're not going to have a king. We're not going to have a hereditary monarchy that, kind of dictates how our lives are going to be and what religion we're going to practice and all that. We're actually going to govern ourselves, and we're going to get along despite the disparate interests involved with the different colonies. And I had this conversation recently, John, about the failure of the Constitution with a friend, and he kind of suggested that, well, the Constitution really has failed because we're not able to live together peaceably, at least not perfectly peaceably, and we see this divergence of basic ideas about what humanity is and what life is and where our rights lie, and we just have this proliferation of new rights claims and stuff that are nowhere in the Constitution. And he was saying, doesn't that sort of evidence a failure of the Constitution? And I said, well, it depends. Do you think that all of the disparate views of Christianity and all of the kind of crazy cults that you see spring off of Christianity evidence the failure of the Bible? I mean, has it failed as the founding document, as the Constitution, as it were, of the Christian Church? And the answer, of course, for any evangelical has to be no. It hasn't failed. People have failed to heed it. People have failed to live up to it. And in that sense, the founders were exactly right that the Constitution was designed only for a moral and religious people, and it's inadequate for the governance of any other. And there is an inevitability to that that's sad, but also important to admit. Back during the discussion we had, I don't know if you and I had it, but I remember you said something about it on Breakpoint, with some of the school shootings and things, the mass shootings that happened, and there's this continual drumbeat call for gun regulation, like comprehensive common sense regulation of firearms, that basically defanging the Second Amendment. And the point you made at that time, John, was that the Second Amendment is given to a free people, but there may come a point when its defanging or its regulation is virtually inevitable, because we're not acting like a free people anymore. We're acting like an ungovernable people. And that is the case in so many areas now, not just in areas of the Second Amendment and violence and so forth. Yeah, the classically liberal but very socially conservative founders of America, and there was a confluence of those two traditions in there, really envisioned a people governing themselves out of their own sort of virtue, their own ability to restrain themselves and to live moral lives. And that was what Alexis de Tocqueville, who's the conservative favorite to quote, observed about America when he came here. He constantly talked about how Americans are not really governed by force from above. They're really governed by all these institutions and associations that they have with one another, and the traditions of ordered liberty that they've built up. And that's just not as true anymore about us. And so when we talk about what it means to, for the Constitution to succeed, a big part of that conversation, John, has got to be the reformation of society, as Wilberforce would call it. It's got to be that culture reform, not just some sort of imposition from the top or reassertion of the planks of the Constitution.
Right, and that's the mistake I think that many, even conservatives, have made in the last 4 years, being grateful about a reprieve when it comes to religious liberty, or the promises of a remade judiciary and all that sort of stuff. That somehow this was a solution. That the solution really could be given top down. And by the way, those that think getting this president out of office and getting back to kind of a more like normal way of doing things, that's not going to be a solution to the problems created by the Trump years either. All of these things are pre-political realities. And to be clear, I just want to say something before we get a million hate mails about questioning the Second Amendment and the end of the Second Amendment. When I said that then, and I say that now, that there may come a time when the Second Amendment is untenable. I'm not saying that that's a good thing.
Right.
I'm not saying that that a citizenry losing the right to bear arms is not. Is a good thing. I'm just saying it's inevitable if we can't govern ourselves. The loss of freedoms is never good. The loss of freedoms points that something is deeply wrong. But when something is deeply wrong, then you actually have to do the emergency triage stuff that's required. And it'll be tragic. It'll be awful, when and if that happens, and even in the ways that it already has happened. I mean, one looks, for example, at the decision that private corporations made this past weekend to deplatform the president and reduce the platform of many conservatives. It's not tyranny in the traditional sense coming from the government. It's what they're attempting. It's what they have every right to do it, but it's a mark that things are desperately wrong. That sort of freedom is compromised. And where is that coming from? It's coming from the inability of people to govern themselves, across the board, and to trust each other to govern themselves. That's the other part of it, right? And part of that's a really bad idea that that disagreeing with someone is the same thing as hating them, and part of that is irresponsible language that in a culture like ours has to be checked because people can't control their own urges and people. So there's a lot here. But I think the Constitution is a wonderful man-made way of trying to put the life together. It's not Scripture. It's not inerrant. But at the same time, it's not the problem that we face. We are, and I that's why I keep saying Wednesday needs to be a mirror. And I feel like for many people, it's an opportunity to spend a lot more time saying "I told you so," than to really look at what's happening. So anyway.
John, I want to move on to a question here that we got about your appearance on the Strong Women podcast, which is part of the Colson podcast network, and my arch nemesis over there in our race for subscribers. This person writes in, I've heard you mention first when you were interviewed, John, on the Strong Women podcast, and then a few other times on the Breakpoint feed about needing to know what something is before you decide what it's for. You bring up this idea in the context of marriage and gender, talking about needing to know that what women and men were created for, their differences, etc., as a starting point. Can you elaborate on what men and women are made for as two distinct genders, not the purpose of two distinct genders only in terms of complementing one another, but a little more fleshed out? Any resources you would recommend to explore this, geared towards adults, young adults, newlyweds, and college kids?
Yeah, it's my favorite framework, and just for people who haven't heard me say it a million times already, it comes from a T.S. Eliot quote, which it comes from a piece that he wrote called "The Aims of Education." And basically what he says, and it is a paraphrase of his quote, but before you know what to do with something, you need to know what something is for. So before you know what to do with the laptop, you need to know what a laptop is for. If you start with, what can I do with this? I mean, you can come up with all kinds of things to do with a laptop, but it might destroy it. If, for example, if you use it as a hammer, I suppose you could do that, right? But it's not healthy for the laptop. Unless it's a Dell, then it doesn't matter. And, whatever else. So you can just kind of go down the line. We've had this conversation when it comes to, for example, how churches and parents should talk to their kids about sex. We tell kids what to do sexually, like don't do this, do that, here's the line, don't cross the line. But before you know what you should do with these, parts, you should know what these parts are for. And it's just a wonderful framework that can be, I think, applied almost to everything. I've had the same, I found this approach useful when it comes to biotechnologies, when it comes to, whether we're talking about artificial reproductive technologies or vaccines. I find it helpful when it comes to really wrestling with education, not just teaching Bible verses as part of an education, but really rethinking what a Christian education is. And so that's the framework, and I just find it to be extremely helpful. And I do think that the question here having to do with what men and women are for is the right question, and it's also the question that oftentimes is not asked. Most of our conversations about gender roles, at least in the last few decades, has been in the church, has been by and large a reaction against feminism in American culture, which of course has introduced new ways that women should be able to behave. And so the whole conversation has been about roles. What should a woman be able to do? And what should a man be expected to do? And so on and so on and so on. That's the wrong starting point. Before you know what roles should be, you need to know what the design is, right? Roles from one cultural setting to another tend to change because, of the difference in culture, right? So my role, hundreds of years ago, if I, lived in Colorado, would have been, hunter-gatherer. that role changes. But the design that informs that role probably hasn't. And
I saw some pronghorns on the way back to the airport recently.
You did.
John.
There's pronghorns that run through my backyard.
Still do that if you want to. Get your spear and head out.
Oh, trust me, if everything goes south, I have marked different neighborhoods that I could drive to, with my Second Amendment right and to provide food for my family. I've thought about this in light of everything that's happened since 20. I'm not a prepper, but I can
John,
see
I was going to say, John's officially a prepper now.
I'm not prepping. I'm just prepping to prep.
Whatever. Whatever. We know behind that Colson Center banner you've got there, you've got like a store of food, those buckets that you order with all the meals that'll last about 1,000 years. Yeah. Right.
Let's just say I know where I'm going if things happen. It's not staying here.
Well done. He's a man with a plan.
Yeah, I'm not, and I'll leave it at that. But no, the point is that roles change culturally, and I don't think we've kept up with this within the Christian church. And so we've tended to communicate a role for men and women that have more to do with how we're not feminist or how we're not that brand of feminist then what it means. So even the complementarian, egalitarian debate, in my mind, is still pretty anemic. It's missing that real fundamental thing, which the question really gets at, which is what are men and women for? I think I'll jump in quick and say, before you answer what men and women are for, because men and women are for each other, that we need to ask, what are humans for? And humans have a role in creation that is unique from every other created thing. This idea, what Chuck would call the creation mandate, that we are to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, is communicating a particular sort of not role, but a particular sort of design that God gave humans that's unique from everything else. And so the fact that we're either male or female as a human serves that larger purpose as human. So we got to really wrestle with this idea of stewardship, the idea of innovation and creativity, the idea of caretaking, of being a kind of a ruler of the creation to make it glorify God as God intended it. Our faith doesn't start in Genesis 3. Our faith starts in Genesis 1. The description of who we are doesn't start with, Shane, you're a sinner. It starts with, you're part of the image bearers whose job is to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. So that informs an awful lot of this. And from there, I think you can get into a little bit more about, okay, what was God expecting Adam to do? What was God expecting Eve to do? What are those things that are universal, from that point on to the sexes for men and women? Where are the other places in Scripture where I think Scripture speaks to this? We certainly have some of this in the New Testament about, what it means to be a redeemed man or a redeemed woman. We have other, indications throughout Scripture. Honestly, I know that one of the questions was for resources. Look, I tried to explore a little bit of this in the book on same-sex marriage, which, again, I know this question isn't specifically about same-sex marriage, but in order to really understand same-sex marriage, I felt like this needed to be a framework. So that book is just called Same-Sex Marriage, written by Sean McDowell and myself. So that's one place you can kind of see this fleshed out a little bit more. Other resources, I think, for example, there's a lot of women's books that are written to women as wives, as opposed to being women first, so that wives, if that makes sense, the role of wife understood through the lens of being a woman. And for men too, what it means. I think, for example, many of the masculinity books, kind of want to say, well, it's good, It seems to wrestle much more with the goodness of kind of the unfettered man, as opposed to the man that is not the undomesticated man as being the good man,
as opposed to the man who's voluntarily taken on responsibilities and is fulfilling them.
Yeah. So how about this? I'm going to throw this out there. One of the things I like to do when I teach this, because I honestly don't know a great book. Shane, you might know a great book or one that's really helpful. I've been underwhelmed by many of them. But how about this? There's 2 poems. One is called Invictus, right? I am the master of I'm the captain of my fate. I'm the master of my soul. I can't remember which one. Master goes with one and captain goes with the other. I might have gotten those mixed up. Invictus, and then read that, and then compare it to a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called The Village Blacksmith. It is a remarkable contrast in masculinity. So when I teach on this for students, I usually use those 2 things because I don't know anything else. And for women, I think that's one of the things I really love about what Sarah and Aaron have done with the Strong Women podcast. I think I mentioned this the other day. Like, we get so many comments that are like, I thought this was going to be the typical women thing, but it's, yeah. But you know what they mean, kind of that being a woman is being frilly. And what does it mean to be strong? And what does it mean to be great, as a woman, and faithful and so on. And I just feel like they're having a better conversation than it's being had in many corners of the church. So I know that doesn't directly answer this question about where can I go for more, but hopefully these are illustrations that can highlight kind of some of the things that I'm talking about here.
Yeah, John, you mentioned, going back to creation, to Genesis 1 and 2, to asking what humanity is for as a whole before we answer the question of what men and women are for. And I think that's exactly the right question. And when we ask that and we look at man and woman in the context of the garden prior to the fall, prior to any sort of discord or strife between them, you see a great deal there. One of them is one of the things you see is the dominion mandate, and that males were insufficient in ourselves to fulfill that, and so we were given helpers. And that's not just, obviously marriage is the primary referent there, but there's a great deal more to say about that. One of the things that I can't even remember what it was I was reading a while back that sort of turned me on to this fact that to be male and female, to be sexual beings, is how this person put it, is to be a sexed being in all contexts, not just in context of marriage and sex. It's when you go forth out into the world and you undertake a calling or vocation, you're doing so as a sexed being. When you do that as a woman, it's gonna look different than if you had done that as a man, because men and women are distinct. We're different creatures. We're both made in the image of God, and yet we image Him in different ways, both individually and together. And we just are the image of God. It's not an activity we do. That kind of language can be misleading. It's just something that we are, and we're designed to do through our very being. I would say to look at our bodies as well, because that offers a great deal of information about this question, the answer to this question. Women have bodies that are designed for, geared to an incredible degree to nurturing, to growth, to the creation of new life, and that is something that that philosophers and sages throughout history have known. It's an obvious fact. Men have bodies that are much more dedicated toward the application of strength to the external world, or of fine motor skills or things like that. And an evolutionary psychologist would look at that and they would say, or an evolutionary biologist for that matter, would look at that and say, well, men were the hunter-gatherers. They were the ones who went out and killed the pronghorn antelopes on the fields beside the Colorado Springs airport, and the women were the ones who stayed home and nurtured the children. And there's some truth to that in a natural sort of way. But I'd like to go back to C.S. Lewis, as always, when he says one of the most politically incorrect things he ever said in Mere Christianity, and he's talking about these roles of male and female within marriage, specifically in the context of who heads the household, who's the leader of the household, and he says, he asks, I don't know that there's anyone out there who has any strong wish that it should be the woman who leads the household, because women who lead their households don't usually like the same state of affairs when they see it going on next door. They're more likely to say, why poor Mr. X allows that appalling woman to boss him around is anyone's guess. He goes on to make this fascinating point that if you were neighbors with someone and their dog, or your dog, bit their child, he asks, who would you rather deal with, the husband or the wife? And he thinks there's something revealing in the answer to that question, because the wife has what he calls a fierce family patriotism, right? She's inwardly focused to the family, where she is looking out primarily for the interest of those within the household. She has a special trust that she's been given to protect those children and to protect even the good name and interest of her husband. The man, in that case, tends to be primarily focused outward. Lewis says he's the one who is like the ambassador to other kingdoms, to other households. He's the one who sort of meets in summit with other leaders and hashes out these sorts of issues. So if there's a dog bite involved, you'd probably, according to Lewis, rather deal with the husband than the wife. Now, I mention that, John, because I think it brings up a key distinction there, or it hints at, rather, a distinction in our roles, things that we're just designed to do well. And I think that those roles have applications beyond just marriage. So if you're single, you're not exempted from imaging God as a man, imaging God as a woman, from being that distinct sort of creature that He's created you to be, a sexed being. You have that capacity and that duty as well, no matter what your context, because you're always either male or female. I want to recommend a few articles that really dig into this pretty deeply. And then I'll mention something that's a little more accessible. The first thing I would point people to is an article by Stephen Wedgeworth at Desiring God. It's called The Science of Male and Female, and it deals with how nature itself really teaches us that men and women have different designs and therefore different purposes and roles given by God. And it's just an excellent piece in a series of articles there. Joe Rigney made an entry also in that series. It was called What Makes a Man or a Woman? And it deals with sort of the deep theological heart of the biblical design. And it also deals with this very controversial question of authority and submission and how it applies to culture. I would also point people to, for a deeper dive here, to an article by Alistair Roberts. It's actually a lengthy essay by Alistair at the Calvinist International. Don't let the name scare you. It's the article is called Natural Complementarians, Men, Women, and the Way Things Are. The point of the essay is to kind of reestablish so much of the traditional Christian thinking on how the gospel restores men and women to our natural created natures. It doesn't impose some kind of new command on us. Grace doesn't destroy nature. Grace renews nature. It fixes it. That's what Christ came to do, is to restore us. And then the final recommendation here would be another article by Stephen Wedgeworth, who I had on the podcast a while back, by the way. We talked about this. It's called Man and Woman, A Biblical Systematic Anthropology. Again, really, really scary, heady title. But if you can take the time to sit with this article and really digest what he's saying, I think it really gets to the heart of the issue of why God made us male and female, why being sexed beings is a good thing. Of course, for the more accessible recommendation, I just have to put in a self-serving plug for my podcast episode on Upstream with Stephen Wedgeworth. We get into some of this stuff. We talk about what on a concrete level, what would an answer to that question look like, without being, imposing stultifying 1950s type roles on men and women and saying this is the only way things can be. So I thought it was a good conversation. I hope our listener will check it out.
The idea that our bodies actually reveal something about this is something that I think Christopher West deals with pretty well in his book Our Bodies Tell God's Story. And I think Catholics oftentimes have thought through kind of what it means to have kind of a biblical anthropology. And I think that's actually the problem, and I appreciate these other resources that you've recommended, because I think Protestants honestly look at roles first. And I think even Lewis's example, I know he's trying to get us to the examples that you just cited from Lewis. I know he's trying to get us to what's behind those things. But they're examples. They're examples of roles from one neighborhood to the other. And I'm not sure that they point even like, for example, jumping to the conversation between men and women is a conversation of authority and submission. And I would suggest that it's not. It's fundamentally a conversation of design. What are men and what are women? What are men and what are women for? And that the conversation of authority and submission is one of those, but there's a million other ones that happen between men and women. But our culture, I think, has tried to deal with it by saying there is no distinction, that there's nothing to our bodies that tells us who we are, and that there's really nothing, no role historically that got it right, because the story of history, including the story of Christian history, is the story of discrimination. It's the story of chauvinism,
patriarchy, and oppression, and stuff like that.
And it's not helpful for Christians. Which, by the way, there's a new book and you could that I'm reading right now in which you can see this mistake. And I don't want to actually title it because I think it's such a bad book. But it's basically looking at the story of Christian history, especially 20th century Christian history, as the story of chauvinism, as the story of basically making it all about strong masculinity. Now, where I think this author is right is that the author says that in response to that, the church, by and large, just rose up and defended old ways of doing things, right? In other words, it went with this kind of stereotypical cowboy, tough guy, warrior, World War I sort of, hero, vet sort of guy, And that was the answer, is that we've got to go back and restore what was lost. And the truth is, throughout Christian history, we have, I think, locked in on roles far more than we've locked in on God-given design. And just that theological realization that we're created before we're fallen. And so redemption takes us back to creation. And that the roles that we try to work out are themselves things that need to reflect the God-given design of male and female as sexed, embodied individuals, more than either a reaction to cultural norms or a preservation of cultural norms. Mm-hmm. And of course that's hard because we're cultured beings. It's hard to kind of get out of the water and see how we're wet as fish, but that's kind of what we've got to do. So, I've told students this, especially theological students, whenever I speak to them, is that a whole lot more work needs to be done in this area. And I hope more people, do that work in this area. Because there's we need to to think it through.
And there's a parting word of warning too that we need to really give people, and that is that we're living in a time right now when the pendulum is at a particular place along the swing that it's been sort of undergoing. And on this issue, the pendulum is unquestionably in the place culturally of radical egalitarianism. It's that men and women are utterly interchangeable in every conceivable way, and even to the point of men becoming women and women becoming men.
Yeah, see, I would use a different term. I think it's beyond radical egalitarianism. I think that was so 1990s. We're like Gnosticism. I think Gnosticism has been the most helpful description, where that our body. I mean, think about this. I really believe we're quickly at a place culturally speaking, and I think you can go to education, you can go to business, you can go certainly into kind of domestic arrangements or whatever, mm-hmm. as if our bodies can tell us nothing about who we are. In fact, our bodies lie to us. In fact, our bodies get in the way. I mean, this is the most profound. Katie Faust has talked about this, as has. We've had her on the podcast, Catholic scholar from. She's also part of. Joe, man, where's this name? She's a wonderful. She's a wonderful friend, part of Evangelicals and Catholics Together. Anyway, that really, we talk about womanhood right now as if a woman's reproduction is an obstacle to her being truly human. Yes. Think about that. I mean, so in other words, not only that our bodies don't tell us about what it means to be male and female, but our bodies actually have nothing to tell mm-hmm. us and might even lie to us about it. Yeah. I mean, that's beyond egalitarianism. That's a complete reconstruction based on no available data. There's not even a pool of data that we're looking at when we're looking at it in the mirror at that point.
Yeah, and that's why I was pointing us back to the design, the very design of our bodies earlier, because that sort of talk is heretical. I mean, outside of these, whatever you want to call it, complementary and traditionalist Christian circles, you can't really speak that way unless you're maybe sort of a Viking throwback red pill sort of right-wing group. But almost no one talks that way now. If you say a man's body says certain things about what a man was created to do, a woman's body says certain things about what women in general were created to do, the heresy trial is forthcoming. You're going to get burned at the stake. And that is the sort of diet version of the Gnosticism that you were talking about a moment ago, with the exchange of the sexes, male for female, or even the radical view that took root a long time ago, and on the left in particular, which is that a woman must have the right to kill her offspring because that reproductive capacity is a barrier to her achieving full liberation and humanity and thriving. And of course, liberation, humanity, and thriving were understood in very male terms, traditionally male terms, which was, you're going to go to a job, and you're going to work for a boss, and you're going to sit in a cubicle, or you're going to do whatever it is that the career woman was interested in doing at that point. And we should be willing to be a little heretical when we talk about this stuff, and B,
culturally heretical, you mean?
Yeah, culturally heretical. Yeah,
I knew that's what you meant, but I just want to pull that up. Yeah, okay.
I'm using that. Yeah, as a sort of tongue-in-cheek way. And B, we should have a willingness to be historical as well, to get outside of our own cultural historical moment and look back in history and ask, how have things been before? How new is our view? And were there really good reasons people gave for changing to this newer view of things? And one of the hard questions, I spoke to a group of Colson fellows a while back, and one of the hard questions that we was raised after I talked about this issue of the birth dearth, there's just not enough babies, was someone said, how can we do this, when mom and dad are both working outside the home? And I said, well, hey, that's one of the hard questions that we have to answer as a society, because turns out you can't have the majority of women going to work for the majority of the day in their childbearing years and still have above replacement rate reproduction. It doesn't happen. It's never happened in any society ever. When you have that arrangement, it just doesn't work long term. So that's not sexism or patriarchy. That's just the facts, and you have to grapple with that sort of thing. To me, that says we've swung too far in our desire to sort of reemphasize the common nature and dignity of male and female. We have swung in a direction of denying reality to our own detriment, and so we need to.
Well, and it's important to know too, when we do that, not only are we tempted personally to embrace ideas about this that aren't true, but then we create a cultural context in which even people who who want to embrace at least some vision of family and parenthood and some sort of a complementarity can't, right? I mean, I know I speak to I meet moms and dads all the time who tell me about their 20-something-year-olds, mostly daughters but also sons, who want to get married and they can't. It just they can't find it, and why they can't find a good guy. I think is especially true of girls who are
there's an ugly expectation too that's taken shape, and I hear about this all the time in Christian circles, which is that if you're a young lady and your priority is to get married and be a mom and stay at home, you're looked down on as having given up something. You're a failure. Sure. You're wasting your potential, and that's
well.
No bueno.
Look, I mean, I think that's part of the problem, and I also think that in some kind of church scenarios or social situations, and this is maybe why even Christian internet dating has become so popular.
Sounds like a contradiction.
The authors or the alternatives are remote.
Right.
So and this is the cultural realities, right? We are shaped by our cultural reality. It doesn't change what's right and wrong and what's true, but it can change what's available. It can change, whether other people are ready to go along the journey with you and how to get there. And I think that's the pressure that a lot of young men, but especially young women, feel. As far as that goes, and then there's the dynamic too, as marriage is increasingly delayed. That we have the eternal adolescent problem, particularly with young men who are intimidated, by a life partner who doesn't play video games 20 hours a day. So there's a my point is that it becomes a complicating mess.
Yes.
And it's and to go back to the original question, which was like 30 minutes ago, back to the original question, the only way to answer this is not by telling people to do different things. And in other words, we're not going to help, especially young people, emerge into this kind of biblical framework for who God's created them to be by just telling them to do this and don't do this, or like just saying, hey, woman, you behave like this, or man, you go do this. There's such a dearth of knowledge and understanding about who we are as human beings. I mean, we know it corrupts our understanding of bioethics and politics and sexuality and everything else, but this too. And this is, I think, an area of theological catechism. To really go back and say, who are we as human beings? Throughout the history of the church, there's been always initiatives around, the truthfulness of Scripture or the identity of Christ, and answering the challenges that either culture or skeptics have put out. And we're past time for some sort of, I don't know if it's a creed or a catechism or something that really wrestles with the image of God. In fact, that's obviously what John Paul saw when he wrote The Theology of the Body. He was trying to get at that. And of course, we would disagree with some of that as Protestants, but the impulse to theologically kind of frame this out in a better way, and instead of just telling people do this or don't do that sexually, or do this or don't do that as a man or a woman, is what's necessary, I think. So it's a longer fix.
Yeah, my hope, John, at the end of all this is that Christians in the future will be able to look back on our time like we look back on the Arian controversy, where there was a definitive resolution to that controversy at Nicaea, where that theological question, that proliferation of heresy, was dealt with by the church coming together and saying, this is the way it actually is. This is the relationship between the Son and the Father. And obviously our historical circumstances are a little bit different because we don't have this united church. It's different collegially. What would it look like for different denominations to come together? Well, I mean, what would it look like for Catholics and Protestants to come together, and Orthodox for that matter, and speak with one voice on the issue of sexuality and gender? I'm not sure what that would look like, but I have a great hope that it's possible. And I think that if you had been in the lead up to something like Nicaea, or heck, the legalization of Christianity, no one, if you'd have said in a few years this is what's gonna transpire, the church is going to speak with a united voice and condemn this heresy about who Jesus is, I think a lot of people would have said, you're nuts. What are you talking about? That's way too hopeful. But God moves through history. He works, and I think ultimately the way He created us has to reassert itself. You can't deny that forever. To do so will literally take civilizations with it. You just can't do it. Well, I think that does it for today. We're at time here, but I want to thank you so much for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast, folks. We enjoy these Q&A sessions greatly. They allow us to go really far afield, and as you just heard from that discussion, they allow us to tackle some issues that we don't often explore in that kind of depth. And I think it's helpful for me and John, and I hope it's equally helpful for our listeners. We'll be back next week answering more of your worldview questions. If you want to ask one, you can drop us a message on social media or email us at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org, and we'd love to talk about that question on the program. For John Stone Street and the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.